My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And now I'm the host of a show that's also called Give Them an Argument, or GTAA. What I want to talk about today is my new book, which is called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. And it's coming out at the end of April from Zer0 Books. Now, April is a long way away. Some people have expressed, frustration about that, which is nice. It's flattering. But welcome to book publishing. It takes a long time. In fact, John Hunt Publishing, which is the parent company of Zer0 Books, slightly accelerated their usual schedule for this. I actually turned in the proposal, and it was approved back in, I believe, October. And then took me several months to write it, of course, and I finished writing it more or less in March. Initial readers, like my friend and Jackman contributor Lee Phillips and our late comrade Michael Brooks, made all sorts of suggestions about things to add or move around, and took a couple months to write to do all that, and there's an appendix that was written after that, and in any case, I finally signed off on the copy edits for the publisher in early July, and just now I got the cover, right? They sent me the cover of the book, and I posted the cover on Twitter, and even though I had posted about every stage of this process, the proposal, finishing the first draft, finishing the final draft, doing the copy edits, I post about it all in the annoying way that writers tend to do. Seeing the cover was very clearly the first time that much of left Twitter had heard about the book, and the reaction was, of course, calm, rational reflection on what very little you can tell about a book from the title and a blurb, and from the title and the brief description of the back cover and a few blurbs from friends and colleagues in left media. And so people had, very, very thoughtful and calm critiques. I am obviously kidding. The reaction was, let's put it this way. If I had written a book claiming that there was a big problem with people smearing peanut butter on the covers of books, and 1 million people posted videos of themselves angrily smearing peanut butter into the cover of my book, I would think it was pretty awesome advertising, as it seemed like people were going out of their way to demonstrate the premise of the book, and quite similarly here. So I talk about several different subjects over the course of the book. I talk about Antifa and countering fascism. I talk about tankies and what can be learned from the successes and failures of what used to be called actually existed socialism. I do talk about the comedy wars at the beginning. That's an opening hook, and one that was chosen for the title as a representative example of the sort of counterproductive left moralism that I'm critiquing in the book. But because the overall thing that sort of ties all of those subjects together, the overall argument of the book, is that one of the things that's undermining the left and stopping us from winning, not the only thing, maybe not even the main thing, but a thing, and something that's worth talking about, is a counterproductive tendency to reduce politics to this kind of moralistic attitude that creates this culture of constant outrage and scolding that's deeply alienated to most persuadable people whose interests would otherwise lead them to align with us. So having so many people respond to the sight of the cover like a vampire responded to the cross functions as pretty good free advertising. But because I imagine some people saw this and were curious, hey, what does Ben say in the book? How does that relate to the title? I thought I'd read off just a couple paragraphs from the book where I explain the title and make some of those connections. So this is the passage. One of the oddest reactions I've gotten when I've told people that I'm writing a book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns is, why do you think idiots yelling at comedians is important enough to write a book about? Or is cancel culture really that big a deal? Don't you have higher political priorities? The answer is yes, and that's the point. When outraged Romans charged Nero with fiddling while Rome burned, they weren't saying that the annoying way the emperor played his fiddle was more important than the fact that Rome was burning. They were saying that him playing the fiddle instead of doing something about the fire was a problem. But at least his fiddling wasn't making the fire worse. That's where the analogy breaks down. Even if you only spend a few minutes a day tweeting toxic bile at the problematic, and you devote a dozen hours a week to your DSA chapter's labor organizing working group, those few minutes a day contribute to giving outside observers a deeply unappetizing impression of the left. The larger subject, of which canceling comedians is a representative example, is a cluster of left pathologies that includes everything from the revival of tanky attitudes, i.e. knee-jerk apologism for every authoritarian regime that makes use of socialist rhetoric and symbolism, to hysteria about minor political differences within the left, to the bad habit of framing disparities between different groups, primarily in terms of introspective psychodrama about unearned privilege, as if the absence of oppression were something that had to be earned. There are good arguments against all of those things in principle. What I'm most concerned to show in what follows, though, is that they're all symptoms of the failure of the contemporary left to think strategically instead of turning politics into a moral performance. In other words, I'm interested in convincing my friends and comrades to stop acting this way because I don't want us to lose. In other words, I'm not arguing in the book for any sort of so-called heterodox policy positions or anything like that. I don't necessarily think the most fire-breathingly radical slogan on every issue is always the most useful one, but I agree with the people that I'm critiquing about their goals, certainly at least 99.99% of those goals. But what I'm arguing is that they're often failing to think strategically about how to advance those goals, and they're doing that because it's both a symptom of left powerlessness and one of many contributing factors to the perpetuation of that powerlessness during the left's long exile from anything remotely resembling real-world power. It became very easy to start thinking of politics as a performance of individual moral commitment rather than a real attempt at changing the world. And it's pretty easy to see how that could lead to some pretty toxic outrage and scolding culture within the political subculture of the left, especially when it intersects with what's sometimes called cancel culture. Now, in the book, I say that this isn't entirely an accurate term. I think a more accurate term would be something like denunciation culture or public shaming culture. But as is the case in most political contexts, I don't like to spend a lot of time fighting about words. I just use the generally accepted terms and then try to argue about the substantive underlying issue. And so what's sometimes called cancel culture is a cluster of cultural trends that are by no means unique to the left. It's a disease of neoliberalism that infects the entire political spectrum, that has to do with a perfect storm of social atomization, the rise of quasi-monopolistic corporate social media platforms whose incentive structures reward knee-jerk outrage and pile-ons, and certainly it has the kind of toxic bite that it does because of the extreme weakness of the labor movement and the at-will employment that's the norm in American workplaces. But what I claim is that when this larger cultural trend towards mutual surveillance, hair-triggered denunciations, and constant moral outrage over everything and nothing intersects with the specific pathologies of the left, it creates a result that is deeply unappealing to most human beings, including most of the people whose economic interests would otherwise lead them to align with the left. And this really leads into why I think that it's worth talking about these things, right? Obviously, I thought it was worth talking about enough to write a whole book, a short book, but a whole book about it. And that's for a couple reasons, right? And this is why I really think that a kind of thoughtless knee-jerk reaction that some people have to hearing critiques of this kind of counterproductive left moralism along the lines of, oh, hey, if this stuff is a waste of time, isn't complaining about it also a waste of time, is so badly misguided. It's not. It's not for at least two reasons. The first, and maybe I'm just being way too optimistic here, but I really believe that many leftists who act in the ways that I criticize in the book are well-intentioned people who really are deeply committed to bringing about changes in our material circumstances, bringing about a better society, and they can be convinced to start being smarter, more strategic, more appealing in how they make their case. The second reason is that even when the first one doesn't apply, it's still worth talking about this stuff, because talking about this stuff usefully sends the signal that lots of leftists hate this shit as much as everybody else in the world does. And that itself is incredibly useful because it helps convince people who should be persuadable, who are turned off by this kind of culture of toxic perpetual moral outrage, that they don't have to start liking it to join us. That's important. Final thing I want to talk about in the last few minutes of the video is the subject of, I think, chapter 4 of the book, which is called Antifa and the Pathologies of Powerlessness, where I give as an example of this kind of moralistic framework leading people not on Twitter. And of course we can dismiss that all day because, oh, Twitter isn't real life, whatever, and ignore the fact that these online spaces were where an awful lot of political education, political persuasion, political arguments, and even political organizing happened even before the pandemic set so many people indoors. But an outside of Twitter example of this kind of moralistic approach to politics, making people not very strategic at all, that I talk about in that chapter has to do with the assault last year on the hacky, dishonest, right-wing photojournalist Andy Ngo. And when people were justifying that assault, I heard a lot of talk about how Andy Ngo is a hack, Andy Ngo is a right-wing ideologue, Andy Ngo is not like an honest, neutral journalist, all of which is 1,000% true, but it completely misses the point of why, even aside from any moral problems that you might have with assaulting a non-combatant, it's such wonderful propaganda for the right wing. And in fact, it's exactly the kind of thing that's incredibly useful to them, right? It might even be useful in that instance to Ngo himself to advance his career. That's something a lot of people pointed out at the time. But mostly it's incredibly useful to anybody on the right who wants to justify state repression against Antifa. That should be obvious, but it wasn't obvious to a great many people at the time because they were so focused on the issue of, is Andy Ngo a good person or is Andy Ngo a bad person? Is he going to heaven or is he going to hell? Rather than thinking about this with the most rudimentary strategic sense about what's actually going to advance our goals. And this gets us into two things that have happened very recently. One, if you watch the RNC, first of all, my condolences if you did, but if you did, you'll see a lot of evidence there that the right wing gets a lot of mileage out of talking about how cancelly so many progressives in the left have been. Oftentimes they talk about it in an exaggerated, distorted way. That's to be expected. But the point is, there's a reason they talk about it so much, because they know this issue plays so well for them. And this is exactly what, sure, people like me, also people like Noam Chomsky, people like ContraPoints, people like the late great Mark Fisher, have been warning the left about for years and years that acting this way is a huge gift to the right. And one of the most perverse responses, because again, so many people think about this stuff purely in terms of individual morality, and whether you're signaling that you're on the team of the good people or you're, signaling that maybe you're on the team of the bad people, the point they miss is they'll say, oh, well, how can you talk about this now that the right wing is talking about it so much? How can you continue talking about how we shouldn't do this? Yeah, guys, the fact that the right wing gets all this mileage out of it is exactly what we were warning you all along, and it's exactly a good reason to cut it out now. Not because we think we can convince the right, but because we don't want to make it easier for them to convince everybody else. And this brings us to something that just happened. As I'm recording this on Sunday night, it's extremely fresh. It's still going to be pretty fresh when you watch this on Monday. And who knows, maybe by the time you watch this, more information that will come out that puts this in a different light. We're in a fog of war situation right now. Who knows? But here's what we know. What we do know is that there have been clashes in Portland between left-wing activists and Trump-supported and even fascist or quasi-fascist creepy organizations like Patriot Prayer, and somebody who seems to have been affiliated with Patriot Prayer was just shot. And this dead person on this side of the clashes, again, who knows what happened there? And also, none of this is to suggest any sort of moral equivalency between the two sides of those clashes. Again, as I've been emphasizing this whole time, that's not the point. What the point is that I'm very disturbed by a lot of the reactions I've already seen from some leftists who don't seem to begin to get how this death is just a gift wrapped up in a bow for the right wing, for the Trump administration, as it may be looking for ways of selling a much wider part of the public on going along with all kinds of terrifying neo-McCarthyite state repression of the left. And I can't imagine a more disturbing reminder of how important it is that we cut out all of the weird moralistic nonsense and start to think strategically in ways that we've got to do if we don't want to keep losing.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.